by Jim Loring, humanitarian photographer. Mr. Loring first traveled to Romania in 1987, that's before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Since then, he's had over 70 international assignments covering humanitarian issues around the globe. He moved to the United States in 2004 and teaches at North Georgia Technical College, and continues to travel on his breaks. Let me remind you all that after this event later today at 5:30, there's going to be a reception and is there a talk also, or just a reception?
You'll have an artist talk.
An artist talk and reception in the Swag Gallery in the Art Building. So, without further ado, Jim Loring.
I'm going to stand by the microphone over here. It's great that so many of you have turned out today, and I love that you've got notebooks. Some of you have got notebooks out. Hopefully there'll be time for questions right at the end, but I'm just going to dive straight in. I love Nelson Mandela. This was taken in London, and that quote, I think, is just amazing and so true. Moments after this photograph was taken, Nelson Mandela bent down and spoke to a 12-year-old boy just to the right. He said, "Young man, what are you going to do with your life?" I couldn't hear the answer, people crowding in and putting their hands in there, but isn't that the question? Isn't that the question for all of us to ask over and over again through our lives? And I'm hoping you'll be able to glean some thoughts on that through what I have to say today. What are we going to do with what we've got? What are you going to do with your dreams? And having a dream, I think, is just such a great, great place to start. This was taken in Haiti. I couldn't believe it, actually, when I saw that. Didn't sound great, but what's he doing with what he's got? He's making what he can out of it. Just amazing. No boundaries is the theme of the exhibit, exploring invisible walls, invisible boundaries that separate so many things. Some of the themes that are being explored are the invisible line that separates childhood from adulthood and what that means. What's the invisible line between success and failure, wealth and poverty? What are the invisible walls that separate so many of us? And I think it's human nature so often that we step into our safe zone, that we're with people that we feel comfortable with, and it's very difficult to cross that invisible barrier and talk to people that are not within our group. They don't think like us, they don't talk like us, they don't dress like us, they don't believe the same things as us. Well, No Boundaries is about blasting through those barriers and finding out that actually they are in fact invisible walls, and we have far more in common, humanly speaking, than we can possibly imagine. This photograph taken in 1989 in Sao Paulo in Brazil, a group of street kids, and when I first saw these street kids, they were ducking and diving and running from me, but when they saw the partner that we were with, the partner that they knew and trusted, we started to draw a little bit closer. This is glue in this bag. This little boy puffing in and out. He's probably high as a kite when this photograph was taken. Another one of the little lads stuck his finger out, a greasy little finger, and touched the end element of my lens and left a massive, great greasy mark with his fingerprint on the end of the camera. And my instinct was to pull the camera back straight away, and so often that's the divide that separates us in the world. You know, me from my comfortable world and this camera that's worth a lot of money. And on reflecting on that, I'm thinking, man, is my camera really worth more than the life of this little kid? When I was out there, I heard another story of a street child who'd been murdered and left in a cardboard box. Written on the cardboard box was, "I killed you because your life has no value." The invisible line that separates childhood from adulthood. This lad, Ray, maybe 17 years old, I don't know exactly, taken at the same time, lived on the streets most of his life, had not received the nurture, the education, the encouragement, the safety that most of us in this room would probably know. It's extreme. And yet, you know, so often people see adults, or what appears to be adults on the street, and the response is, why don't you just go and get a job? Why don't you go and take responsibility for your life? Well, of course, it's not as straightforward as that. How do we respond when we see people in need? This photograph taken in a slum, if you will, in Brazil. This little lad I was focused on his face, and suddenly that hand reached out. And it's like you're going to get hit in the face, but what's What's your response going to be when that happens? Is it going to be to withdraw and step back and disengage because it's really, really uncomfortable to hold your ground? Or are you going to hold your ground? And the project that I was working with, run by Child Fund, had incredible stories, incredible success. They held their ground, they were working with these kids, and they were taking these kids half a day, 1 or 2 days a week, giving them an education, a primary education, a safe place to play, which was really groundbreaking. These kids had nowhere safe to go at all. Access to healthcare, a decent meal, it was totally transformative. And so generationally, you could see the results of these kids going through this project. This lad was one of the kids on the street. He had an education, it transformed his life. It's pretty darn remarkable. The math teacher, pictured here, afterwards he said to me, Jim, you know, I was one of those kids on the street. That was me. But he went through the project, he went to university, he became a math instructor in a mainstream university. That's the power of education. And I think so often when we're saturated with so much access to culture and education and wealth, we can very easily take these things for granted. But when we see what it means for people living in poverty, we can really see the transformative power of what we're talking about. So the presentation, no boundaries, it's a global perspective. 30 years, so the oldest photograph of the exhibit was taken in 1989. The picture of the lad there with the bag of glue that he was sniffing. And I chose 36 images to remind me of an old roll of 36 frames of black and white film. It's been an amazing experience. And you know, one of the driving forces for me was to try and make sense of my life in the context of the whole world and not just living in a comfortable South England town. I was living in Guildford, a nice comfortable town, very cosseted. It's like being surrounded in cotton wool. Everything's taken care of. But I wanted to understand what life was like for everybody. And images in the, let's see if I can get my pointer to work. We've got images from Cambodia over here. We've got images from Afghanistan. In Africa, Ethiopia, I'm going to show you in this presentation and also in the exhibit. Down here we've got Zambia and Malawi, excuse me, Mali, there are pictures from here. There are pictures from the Dominican Republic, a couple of pictures from Colombia, and in Brazil, Fortaleza, Recife. Fortaleza was the name of the town where we just saw photographs, and this photograph also was taken there. As a photographer, I kind of break images down into 3 or 4 different areas. Actually, as a photographer, there's lots of things going on in your head when you're constructing an image. And there are lots of layers that I'm thinking about. One person said to me of this photo, there are no straight lines. It's kind of deliberate, kind of symbolic of what life is like for these people living in this situation. There's a background, there's a context where the picture was taken. Sometimes I think of it as the stage where a piece of action is going to take place. There are details, defining details, details that add definition to our understanding of what we're looking at. And in this picture, the chain hanging down in the middle of the picture, the little kid in the hammock. And then there are facial expressions, and that woman's gaze looking straight at me. Somewhat uncomfortable, and it is uncomfortable, and I chose the photo because it is uncomfortable, and perhaps rightly so. This photograph taken in 1989 also. And we were working with a film crew. I was a stills photographer, just with black and white film in my old Nikon F3 camera. You know, whenever you arrive in an area, in a slum, and you've got a film crew, 20, 30 people, lights, cameras, producers, directors, lots of noise, everybody gathers around and watches what's going on. And there are great opportunities to be had just pulling back. And I walked away from all of that action and leant across this fence at this lady who didn't want any part of that. Pointed to my camera, asking permission, is it okay for me to take photographs? And she shrugged and said, yeah. And so I took about 6 frames. One picture, roll the camera on. The next picture, roll the camera on. Became really aware of this process of, I'm watching you, watching me, watching you. The camera was a witness to me meeting this woman, and this moment of her pulling back on a cigarette. Who the hell are you? This rich, wealthy Westerner come with his expensive camera to take a photograph of me. It's uncomfortable, deliberately so. But so often when I photograph people in developing countries, the first response is this, and this beaming smile, this moment of fame, this kind of opportunity. It's as though I've asked someone to have their photograph taken and it's their special moment. I am important, and this beautiful smile. I've seen it 1,000 different times. And this picture tells the story of what happens when a Westerner with a camera pulls someone out of the crowd to take a photograph of them. This is the story that picture tells. But the story that I'm more interested in as a photographer is, how do these people feel about their daily lives when I am not there? That's the really interesting picture. And I took 2 pictures of this lad in Colombia. Their lives were controlled by drug lords, and all of the kids in this, it was a soccer project, working with these kids. They'd all seen way too much violence, a complete lack of security, witnessed atrocity, lived in terror, and of course that scar across his eye tells a story as well, and that really drew me to this lad, first of all. So as a photographer, there's lots of things going on, and one thing that really drew me to the craft and of photography in the first place was the fact that it is the only art medium that has the potential to capture reality. It doesn't always do it, and of course we're very familiar with the term an image has been photoshopped. It's a distortion of reality, but it doesn't take away from the fact that a photograph can capture reality. This is Ramona. She lives in Guatemala. How does she feel about her daily life? What is the background or the context? What are the details in this image? All of that was going on in my head as I was photographing. Ramona told me that she lives on tortilla and water, and that's all they have. So education as a transformative force in the world, and I think in the West we're really saturated with education. I mean, who loves to go to school? Who do you know who really, really loved going to school? I certainly didn't enjoy going to school. And yet where there is lack of education and the result of that is absolute poverty, it makes a big difference. And little Hannah in the middle there in the pink dress, she was a part of the study, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her in just a minute. It was an amazing adventure. We drove out of Addis Ababa for about 6 months, 6 hours, 6 months, it felt like that. And then we hiked for about 5 hours down into the depths of the Rift Valley, all our bags on the donkeys, as you could see. This is little Abraham looking after the goats deep down in the Rift Valley, and Hannah again looking after the kids and the chickens, and this is their life where they live. And yet these kids have observed and they know the difference that education can make. Hannah wanted to become a teacher. Abraham wanted to become a doctor. With the access to education, that becomes a real possibility for these kids. Of course, they've got to work really hard to be able to attain that. The school itself cleared ground, donated ground, and the government had supplied the materials to build the schoolhouse. The teachers were volunteers, and just an amazing, amazing project to witness. I went back about a year and a half later, back into that area, not back into that actual project, but we got to the village at the end of the road. Remember I said we drove 6 hours and then we hiked 5 hours. Well, 6 hours out, there was a market. How we bumped into Hannah and Abraham again, I do not know. But this photograph was taken a year and a half later. And there's me looking a lot younger. Showing the magazine where the photographs have been printed of Abraham and Hannah. You can see Abraham pointing to a picture of himself in the magazine. The other picture on that page, I'm going to show you that in a moment as well. But look at Abraham's shirt that he's wearing. I'm going to show you the picture that was published. Looks like he's grown. It was an amazing project, and there was another community in the area who heard the success of the education project, and they went to the government and they said, we want to have a school as well. Well, the government said, you know, we'd love to give you the materials for a school, but there's no road. If there was a road, we could get the materials to you, but there is no road. So there was a project initiated by a group of relief agencies. People were given a minimal amount of pay, and they built a road. The whole community came out and built a road. It was the most astonishing thing I think I've seen. The road itself, 28 miles long. There it is. You can see it way up into the distance. How much effort are we going to put into getting what we want to achieve in our lives? So my journey in photography began with this. This is a Zenit E 35mm film camera. My mother purchased it from a mail order catalogue for Christmas when I was 17. That's the only way I could get that kind of a camera. And I fell in love with photography. The camera itself was a complete dog to use. And if you know anything about photography, it had a non-automatic lens, which does not mean that it did not focus automatically. It meant that everything was manual. And let's see if I can point to the ring here. You see it says f5.6 here, little red dot. So you preset your aperture to f5.6, and then there'd be this ring here that you'd have to manually twist to stop down to f5.6 before you took the photograph, and then you could take the photograph. It was a complete dog to use, but of course I was hooked. I fell in love with photography. Went on to buy a Nikon. I've still got this Nikon 35mm camera, a roll of 35mm film, black and white T-Max. I used to push that to 800 ISO. That may mean something to a few people, increase the development and reduce the amount of exposure needed. And that pile of books, documentary photography at the top there, Time Life books, had pictures from photographers such as Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans, who photographed the Depression, the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Those pictures were a real inspiration. And as I said before, photography, the only craft, only art form that has the potential to capture reality. I was very much hooked. And that dream of becoming a photographer was a really important part of setting the trajectory of my life, the direction in which I was going to go. And when I was asked to talk here today, vocation, calling, how do we set the trajectory of our life, that was a big part of the theme. So I want to share some of that as well, demonstrating obviously what I've done. But living in England, I can remember a period when I was probably around 21, 22 years old. And I'm guessing there's a lot of us in the room, or a lot of you in the room that are around that age. And I was asking a lot of these questions about the meaning of life and what am I going to do with my life, and looking at the stars. And the stars are astonishing. Talk about perspective. In our own galaxy, 100,000 years at the speed of light to get one side of the galaxy to the next. Our galaxy, one of millions in the universe. Me, minute in comparison. Wow, there's perspective for you. The biosphere, the outer limits of our atmosphere, 12 miles from the depths of the ocean to the outer limits of the atmosphere, the only place in the known universe that we know there is life. And maybe life somewhere else, but we don't know it. We probably don't know it. Actually, I know a few people who think they know it. However, we know that we're here, and we've all got these. Isn't that amazing? The fact that we're alive, that we're living people in the universe is quite astonishing. And my thought process back at the time was, we live in this world, and our sense of our own value very much based on where we fit in the pecking order. Am I powerful or am I weak? Am I beautiful? Am I not as beautiful as this person? Am I popular? No, I'm not popular. Have I got a good education? Am I wealthy? Am I strong? Am I a sports player? Am I da-da-da-da? You get the picture. We get our sense of our own status and value from those things. And yet, here we are, the only place in the known universe where there's life. I've got a faith in God as well, and that informs this as well. But regardless, isn't it astonishing that we are alive? And that was a real game changer for me in terms of setting the trajectory of my life. If I was of value as a human being, that meant that everybody else on the planet was valuable as a human being as well. I could not separate the two. It would not actually hold ground. Furthermore, the weakest of the weak, the poorest of the poor, the most desperate of the desperate is of equal value to the most powerful, the wealthiest, the strongest, the smartest, the most beautiful in the same moment. That as a set of values is core to the way that I've approached my whole life, and certainly my work as a photographer. This photograph taken from my doorstep at night. Every journey begins here. And it has to for me. Every journey has to begin here. And I've seen some pretty appalling things as a photographer. This photograph taken in the year 2000 in Ethiopia. Green famine, Rains came early that year. In fact, there have been 3 years of crop failure as a result of climate change. You know, so often our reference photographically in terms of images for climate change is the pictures of those polar bears on a piece of ice that's floating in the ocean. You know, climate change has been a reality for a lot of people for a long time. And in 2000, the result of climate change for these people was starvation. This man had been lying on the pallet for 2 weeks. This is his wife and his daughter. You know, to take this photograph, I had to kneel in the dirt on the ground, and I put my camera on a little stool, because technically there was not enough light to be able to get an exposure. It's taken on like 1/15 of a second with the aperture wide open. Technically, I'm right on the edge. That was the reason I was kneeling on the ground. Afterwards, the partner that we were working with said that the people have been watching the way that you're working, and they say, we want you to know, thank you for suffering with us. And I'm thinking, you've got to be kidding me. Thank you for suffering with us. And I thought they were kidding, first off. And yet, on reflection, I thought, you know, they wanted to communicate that to me, and I need to honor that sentiment of what it is that they want to say to me. And so, in a sense, it's laying down the gauntlet. Are you going to continue doing this work that actually is pretty difficult? It's pretty difficult to get there, and it's pretty difficult to see. It's pretty difficult to reconcile after you've been there and after you've seen it. Also in the Green Famine, Tamara and his daughter Judy. We met him and his family the day before this photograph was taken, and at a food distribution, I saw Tamara from across the crowd, and he turned toward me as though giving permission for the photographs to be taken. I'm watching you, watching me, watching you. The camera's a witness to this event. His daughter Judy, around 9, 10 years old, in the late stages of malnutrition. Her hair had turned red, it should have been black. You can't see the full picture here, but her ribs distended, her eye swollen, covered in flies, a little piece of branch that she's holding to brush the flies off of her face. This picture is, for me, a picture of bravery. 3 years of crop failure had left Tamara and his family destitute. And I call this absolute poverty. It's not extreme poverty, it's absolute poverty, because you watched your children die. That is the result. You do absolutely everything in your power to survive. And yet this is what you've got to face. You know, I can't give much back to the people that I photographed. But somehow there's an unwritten contract between me and the people that I photographed. It's an unwritten contract that says it's incumbent upon me to keep telling their stories, because those stories really matter. That's a major driving force in terms of the way that I've carried on doing the work that I do and telling the stories. One family were too poor to send their kids to the free school. They had to work the fields. This is the other photograph that was in that magazine that I told you about. And you know, the lad on the left, all the hopes of the future. Somebody said he looked a little belligerent. I think he's got a bit of attitude. I think he has every right to. I hope he was able to live a successful life. The girl in the foreground, about 14, 15, was prevented from going to school and get an education that would have been her way out of poverty. The 5-year-old Jurabay there, and a father and mother looking maybe somewhat ashamed. They lived on about 20 cents a day. That was their income for the entire family. These were the fields that they worked in. This is the face of absolute poverty around the world, and there's way, way too much of it. In contrast, I was in Mali and I spoke to the director of the Red Cross in Mali, and I said, what's the greatest strength, do you think, of the people living in Mali? He said, the ability to live with dignity in spite of poverty. What an amazing, amazing line. And I thought, you know, it's not just in Mali. I've seen this throughout Africa, and I've seen it in many other places around the world as well. The ability to live with dignity in spite of poverty. This is Margaret. Margaret lived in a slum area just outside of Nairobi in Kenya. And you can see there's a pot bubbling away on the ground there with hot cocoa in it, and you can see her tin mug. There were about 4 of us that were wandering around this slum in the evening, just talking to people, and Margaret bent down and she filled that mug up with cocoa over the top, and it was just pouring over the side of that mug, and just handed these 4 cups out to us. She told us this was her only meal for her and her grandchildren for the day, and she gave it away. You know, it may well turn out that the most significant thing that we do in our lives is something that we have no knowledge of whatsoever. Maybe that I'll jot something on a piece of paper and I'll throw it away because I think it's worthless, and somebody else picks that up and it's a great inspiration. Maybe one of the photographs that I take will actually impact someone to the degree that it changes the course of their life. And I've heard people tell me that. There was one lad told me that he saw the pictures I took of Romania back in 1987. And he decided he was going to go out there and work in the orphanages out there. And that's what he did. He devoted his life going out there. What a result. That is, you know, that's as good as it gets as far as I'm concerned. But we don't know the impact of our lives, and I think that's an important thing to know as well. Of course, Margaret's life is worth far more than that moment where she handed hot cocoa. But what a sermon, what a lesson, what a thing to communicate to all of us. So it's hard to look into the face of poverty. We're back in Brazil now, in the slum area. A mother and her daughter. Life is just unbelievably hard. And for many of the young women in this situation, being locked in poverty was a very real reality. There were a lot of the girls that were looking pretty provocative in that slum area. Actually, no different from what we would expect walking around our own towns. But in that context, it seemed a little bit out of place. But what a profound injustice, because the moment those girls became pregnant, that would be it. Their life would be locked into poverty. If you look at the mother's face, you can just about pick out there's a scar on the left-hand side of her face. It goes down under her chin. It was as a result of surgery that she had as a child. Pretty darn brutal surgery that left her with this scar. Living in poverty means this. Vulnerability was the strong theme that I was tuning into when I was photographing in this area. What prospect do these kids have for the future? And contrasting that with the pictures of the project that I showed you right at the beginning. Little boy smiling, doing his homework, doing colouring, learning, embracing an opportunity to move forward with his life and make something of his life. And that's the game changer for these kids. Do they embrace that? Are they able to really grab hold of that and make something of their lives? So no boundaries. That idea has taken me many, many places, and now that I teach, I continue to travel. Every other year I've been able to travel. This was taken in Lebanon, Syrian refugees. You know, nobody wants to be a refugee. Nobody chooses to be a refugee, and everybody I spoke to wanted to go home. But that wasn't going to happen for a lot of these people. Everybody that I spoke to, from young to old, had experienced three specific things. Fear, an extended period of fear that had a huge impact on their lives. Trauma, that they'd witnessed events that I think would leave most of us with PTSD. And a daily struggle to survive. How am I going to survive tomorrow? Am I going to survive tomorrow? Are my children going to survive tomorrow? Totally brutal. Anthony on the right, 84 years old, was going to start a new life in Canada where he had family. He'd lived in Syria all his life. His cousin had been kidnapped by Assad's forces. There was a demand for $16,000 US dollars to pay a ransom. They paid the ransom, they got the cousin back, but when there's troops rolling in all the time, it just becomes untenable to continue life in that situation. So often I heard the story, we went home to our home, it had been bombed, everything that we worked for throughout our whole lives is gone. So they go to the next village, and 3 months later, after they're renting property, they're finding new work, they're managing to feed the family, they come home, the place is bombed out, everything's gone, and then they move to another location. And this was another story that I heard. This family, the kids were screaming out as tanks rolled down the street, they're coming to slaughter us. One family told me that there was a bomb that went off just outside their window, and the glass shattered all across their child's bed, and they had to clear off this child's bed. When that happens 3 times, 4 times, repeatedly, there comes a point where you cannot stay in your own country. And that's the reality of what being a refugee is. Sorry, the photograph is clipped quite badly at the top. But Miriam in the foreground, on the left there. You know, the day this was taken, the doctor had been to see her in the morning and said, look, she can smile again. Her muscle tone was beginning to come back. She'd been hit by shrapnel in the face, and it had destroyed all the muscle tone in her face. Her mother kept on pointing to her forehead here. And through a translator, I learned that she had a neurological condition that the doctor had said this is a result of living with an extended period of fear, where you don't know whether you're going to live or you die, or your children are going to live or you're going to die. And so just a dreadful, dreadful situation. And our response to the refugee crisis, which is greater today than at any time in history, has been probably not as good as it ought to have been. Certainly, the fiscal year, last year, 2018, was the lowest number of refugees allowed into the US that have been on record since 1980, when the refugee, I've forgotten the name of the organization, was established in the US. So refugees are featured. This little lad running up the hill with his land-to-air missile launcher. His mother told me he'd been asking for one of these for weeks and weeks and weeks. It was his toy of choice, and eventually we got him one. And the night that he got it, he popped it underneath his pillow and fell asleep with his land-to-air missile launcher to keep him safe. When you're down at the bottom, you can only look up. Another refugee child. Cambodia. HIV/AIDS is something that has really destroyed, or had destroyed, an entire generation of young adults. And this little girl in the foreground had lost her mother to AIDS, her grandmother in the background there. And in that culture, it would be traditional for a grandparent to be looked after by their children in their age. And of course, there is no one to look after her. Now she's left responsible looking after her grandchildren. Look at the hands there. And the photo in the exhibit across the road is of the grandmother holding the hands of her grandchild. That's what she's left with. But it was the same story that I'd heard over and over again in so many parts of the world. And this was before antiretroviral drugs were available. Statistically, things are heading in the right direction now in terms of preventing the results of HIV/AIDS, being able to live a long time with HIV/AIDS. This photograph taken in 1989 in Uganda, a 19-year-old girl with her mother. She has AIDS, the young daughter has AIDS. At the time, the moment you've been diagnosed, a 3-year life expectancy is where you're at. That's changed. Zambia, the lady here in the foreground, she'll be leaving those children behind very, very soon. Her husband had got AIDS and has already passed, gave it to her, and now she's looking forward to an untimely death. Antiretroviral drugs were not available. I heard the same story over and over again. One lady in Cambodia, we said, what can we give you? What do you want? She said, antiretroviral drugs so I can live long enough to see my children grow. Dominican Republic, same story. This lady's husband had given her AIDS, he's already passed, and she wanted to live to see her kids grow. And it wasn't going to happen. So such major, major things in the world. And one theme from the presentation this morning, the way that education can be a real game changer. These photographs taken last year in Afghanistan, the Afghanistan National Institute of Music. I was told it's the happiest place in Afghanistan, and probably a very different picture from what we're used to hearing and seeing from Afghanistan. The school itself, 30% of the students are young women. That is unheard of in Afghanistan. And these girls, these young women, would not be able to return back home to their villages for fear of, well, death and who knows what. But here they were pursuing their dreams to be musicians and to move forward with their lives. I asked the director, Dr. Samas, what does Afghanistan need more than anything? He said, education, culture, and art, and especially music, obviously with the music school. One of the young women I was interviewing, she said, you know, the people hear the music and they remember who they are. You know, of course, we're saturated by culture, of art, of music, pictures, photos. We're surrounded by it all the time. But imagine a world where all of that is stripped bare. There is none of it whatsoever. Within that context, to hear the words, they hear the music and remember who they are. really has some clout in it. That comes to the end of my little kind of photo presentation, but look, there's the themes that I want to leave you with. For me, dreams, embracing what is good and true, defining your values, education, learn to think, write and speak, and turn it into a set of goals. Those 3 or 4 things are real game changers. And in terms of vocation, calling, figuring out the trajectory of your life, I think these things are game changers. Embrace your dreams. Get in touch with what really matters to you. Embrace what is good and true. I think if there's any divide in the world, it's those that embrace what is good and true and those who reject what is good and true. I've seen both, but for the most part, people want to embrace what is good and true. They want to work hard, they want to provide for their families, and they want to live a good life. Define your values. Those of you in education, take advantage of what is an unbelievable privilege and opportunity. Learn to think, learn to write, learn to speak, gain your voice, work out what it is that my life is all about. By golly, we all need it. We need every one of you to stand up to the plate and make the world a better place. Turn it into a set of goals. Dream, define your values, goals. Dreams, values, goals. Hope you got it. For me, my dream was to become a photographer. My set of values defined when looking at the stars. Goals, very specific. SMART goals you may have heard about. Specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, timely goals. Grab a hold of that. Make those goals very real. And also for me, a set of stepping stones after that of meeting people, especially in Ethiopia, and Tamara and Zuli in particular. Under a blood-red sky, the wind howls an endless cry. Remember me, my life, my faith, my hopes, my dreams, my work, my breath, my death, wrapped together in an endless cry. Remember me. Thank you. So it's been great to be able to talk to you this morning, and I love this setting. It's intimate enough that we can do a bit of Q&A. Where's Carson? Carson, I can't see you. How are we doing for time? I know we're tight.
I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. We wouldn't have to spend all 10 minutes, we have up to 10 minutes.
That's great. Excellent.
Yeah.
Good. So, who's brave enough to kind of dive in and stick their hand up? Yeah.
Where are your next plans to go?
That's a $6 million question. And I've been on a 2-year cycle. So last year I went to Afghanistan. Next year will be the next time I've been looking to travel. Most of these trips is come from just talking to people, and things have come to me rather than me kind of seeking them out to any great extent. You know, in 1987 I went to Romania, photographed orphanages. There was one orphanage I remember had 140 babies, 10 members of staff, including all the cooks and the cleaners. And you go into a single room with maybe 10, 15 cots in it, each with a baby in, and the room was silent. And those babies have cried themselves to sleep. And studies have been done on touch deprivation using those orphanages as a reference point for that. 1987, you know, I might do a return trip. I think I'd quite like to go back and see what life is like now in those orphanages. But the bottom line, I don't know when the next trip's going to be. Any ideas? Plenty of places to go, that's for sure. Thank you. Yes?
When looking, is there a story behind maybe the first time you looked up at the stars, or like any story for you about when you realized your values through the stars?
You know, it was a time of kind of questioning for me, and I started college. Let me see. I think I've been at college about 6 months, and you know, my faith in God my personal faith has always been really important to me. And I think other friends at college have been challenging me on that and saying, "So Jim, you say that you're a Christian, whatever that's supposed to mean, and so that means that you believe this and this and this and this and this." And to be honest, I didn't know exactly what I believed about a lot of things. And so it was a deep questioning time for me, trying to figure out, you know, in a sense, what's the least I need to believe to be, okay? And I look back at that time now, and I think, if I was living it now, I'd probably experience it in a slightly different way, and probably closer to the way that I've described it today. That sense of wonder that we are alive today, and certainly that all of us are in this thing together. And that value system that, if I'm of value, then that means that you have to be of value. And every one of us in the room is of equal value, and each one of our lives really matters. Does that help a little bit? It's a great question, and it's probably, that's an hour's conversation, isn't it? Which is great, yeah. Somebody right at the back, I can see a hand.
What about photography you fell in love with?
Say it again, what about photography?
Did you fall in love with? Like, what made you fall in love with photography?
That set of Time Life books I showed you, there was a picture of the Nikon with the film and the Time Life books. My first job was working in a darkroom, and I did a trade out for that set of books. And looking at those books and looking at the pictures, I think was a real time of getting hooked on photography. Those pictures of the Dust Bowl, but many, many other pictures in there. Many people might question whether photography is an art form, and I fell in love with photography as an art form. An artist is someone who's striving to find the medium that they can use to express what's inside them. And in a sense, what's inside them is the thing that makes them an artist, not so much the thing that they use to convey that message. And all artists use the same language to describe what they do. Shape, form, rhythm, contrast, hierarchy, tension, release. If you're a photographer, that's the basic language of art that we would use. If you're a painter, we'd use the similar language. Shape, form, rhythm, contrast, hierarchy, tension, release. If you're a dancer, we would use the same kind of language. Shape, form, rhythm, contrast, hierarchy, tension, release. Music, writing. It's the language of art. And so I fell in love with art, and photography has been my medium for conveying the things that I believe really matter. It's a great question. Does that help at all?
Yes.
It's great. Thank you. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
Well, you were just talking about art, reminded me of a quote that I read somewhere, and I couldn't tell you who said it. It was in a book that my grandpa gave me one time called Art and Fear. At the beginning, it says something like, no, actually the book doesn't say this. My grandpa inscribed this inside the book. My grandpa said it.
I love it.
He said something to the effect of, an artist never has to worry about failure. Just to be one is already a success. Something like that. But what you were saying reminds me a lot of this. You talked about values. I'm going to mention a virtue. Courage. Courage came through with so much of what you were talking about. Your courage to go to these places where you probably put yourself in danger a few times, I would imagine. The people that you photographed, who had tremendous courage to live in the situation in which they were living and to interact with you in this way, to show you their courage as well as their vulnerability, so on and so forth. And then also perhaps our cultural lack of courage in embracing refugees, for instance, legally. So my question is, I'm sure that with all this courage, there were times, nevertheless, when maybe your knees buckled, when you felt some fear, or perhaps the people you were with felt fear. And failure is such an important part of living a meaningful life. But we had that courage to face that failure. Could you maybe expand a little bit on a time when you might have felt a lot of fear?
It's a great topic. And as you're talking, I'm thinking, referencing different times when that really kind of resonates with me. Courage to actually stand up and be the person that you are. Finding your voice in the biggest sense of the word is one thing, but actually having the courage and actually allowing that voice to be heard. It takes a lot of courage to do that. I often think that the value of something is directly proportional to how vulnerable somebody is prepared to be in terms of telling their story. If I'm completely guarded and I don't give anything of myself, well, there'll be value attached to that. But when somebody is really bearing their soul and bearing their heart, that has real depth to it, real value. And I think most of us, when we hear that, we respond in kind and have the deepest respect for what we're hearing. Not always the way, but it takes a lot of courage to be really vulnerable and tell it as it is. Where should we go with that? There was a community in India after the tsunami. Their community had been ravaged, and they lived on the coast, and there was a little island just off from where this community was, maybe a quarter of a mile out, and palm trees on this island. I'm standing on the mainland talking to these people. They said the tsunami, when it hit, it was over the top of the palm trees, and everybody on the island was killed by this in just the most dreadful way possible. The whole community had been devastated, but it took one person in the end to stand up and say, we've got to get on with our lives. And it was a fishing community, so they started mending the nets, mending the boats, and painting the boats, and getting out and fishing and starting to get on with their lives and move forward again. And it took one person to go against the current of everybody's feeling, which is utter devastation, to say, we have to move forward. And of course, we do have to move forward. They did have to move forward. But unbelievable courage to actually stand up and do that. To find your voice, to stand up and go against the grain of what everybody else around you might be saying for the good of all, takes unbelievable courage. And yet it is transformative and deeply, deeply needed. There are so many other things we could talk about there, but yeah, it's cool. Yes.
Okay, friend, here we go.
Yeah, go on.
One of the things that I really admire about your work is your transparency, because you up front talk about the fact that you're a white male going into these environments. And I immediately think of, many of us know the work of Anthony Bourdain, and as a journalist, not just a foodie, but the real depth of his work when he went into all these different countries and gave us glimpses as Americans on CNN, worlds that journalists didn't have the opportunity to do. How do you as a person refuel yourself and kind of having experienced just little glimpses of this poverty, of this pain, of death, of oppression, of injustice? How do you fill yourself back up? Because I think about the young people in this room that may be really inspired by your work. And we lost Anthony Bourdain.
Well, there's a high price tag to doing this kind of work, and I think, well, Anthony Bourdain, of course, but there are many other stories. You may remember, I'm going to struggle with the name of the photographer, Pulitzer Prize winner, took a photograph of a vulture with a starving child in the background. And the story goes that he took so much flack for taking that picture. In the end, he couldn't reconcile that, and he took his own life.
Right.
There's no simple answer to that question, Marie, but I'll tell you a few things. Coming back from some of my earlier trips, it was difficult, and yet I kind of reconciled it. I kind of made sense of it in my mind. And there was a point where I thought, okay, I've got this licked. And I went on the next trip, and bam, I'm faced with a whole new set of stories and experiences, and I'm right back to square one. And that has been my experience, that every single trip that I've done, there is a huge price tag, personally, attached to that. When I worked for a relief agency full-time in the UK, anybody who's traveling on a regular basis would have 2 biannual debriefings with a counsellor, basically. And I can remember one morning on my calendar, it popped up, you've got the whole morning set aside for your debriefing. And I'm thinking, great, I've got appointments, I've got a bucket load of work, there was no time to do this, but that was the requirement. So I sit in this small room with this amazing woman, and she said, okay, Jim, this is your time, we have to do this. I know you don't want to be here, but this is it. So I kind of slumped back, folded arms, like, okay, great, let's go. And she said, okay, well, let's start. Just think about 1 or 2 of your last few trips. Think about the practical details, the flights and booking the hotels and getting the money exchanged and your passport, your visa sorted. Immediately, I went to an event that had happened about 3 months before that, photographing in Sierra Leone, in Freetown, in a place called Amputee Camp. Amputee Camp was full of amputees, and it's the location of blood diamonds. Sierra Leone borders with Liberia. Illegal diamonds were traded across the border for weapons that were fueling the conflict. The rebels were getting their weapons by trading their diamonds. And the government had a slogan there, said hands up for peace. And the rebel response to that was to gather a dozen people up, shoot everybody except one, and take an arm. There was one man that I photographed, had arms amputated here and here, both arms. And I'd insisted on this trip that we have to visit amputee camp. We need to meet these people because it's the story of what we're trying to convey here. And we didn't really have time for the visit, and we had about 45 minutes in total in this location. And here I am photographing these people, trying to interview these people, and my partner was saying, we've got to leave, we've got to go. And just as I left, this man wearing a woman's dress that was covered in dirt, no arms, was standing in front of me, and I took a photograph of him, and I left. In my debrief session, I've been asked all these other questions, and suddenly I'm right there. And this was the point of conflict for me in my heart. And the person I was talking to said, so, explain this to me, how do you feel about this? And I'm thinking, actually I can't say expletives here, can I? This bleep, 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 bleep. Who the bleep, bleep, bleep does he think he is, taking a photograph of this person who has had all his dignity taken from him? To take one arm is one thing with a machete. To take both arms, the guy can't even take care of his own personal business. He's wearing a woman's dress to make it a little easier. How undignified is that? And the brutality of that act is just phenomenal. And so this deep kind of conflict within me as a photographer. And my debriefer said to me, so that's your remembrance of standing there, but now, also, that's your remembrance of looking at that event. Now go back into that moment where you were there taking that photograph. Tell me about that. And I said, my heart went out to this guy. I could not believe that anybody could do this to him. And in this split-second moment that I had, I wanted to dignify this person as much as I possibly could by the way that I was going to take this photograph, this picture. So it makes any difference at all. But what a game changer in terms of reconciling inner conflict. And I think that's a part of what you're talking about here, reconciling inner conflict from seeing people living on the edge of survival time and time again. Every trip that I've done, I've had to do that process, and it's been different every time. I think you could allow that to suck you dry, to be immersed in guilt for the wealth and the everything that we have here. And what good would that actually do, and how would that honor the people that I've met? Or you could turn it on its head and say, thank you for everything that I've got. Now let's go and shout as loud as we can to try and make the world a better place. I'm being called to an end.
Thank you so much for sharing your As a reminder, tonight at 5:30, there is a talk and reception